The crack of old wood, the hollow thud of my grandmother's Christ figure hitting the basement wall, that was me. I was the one who did that, the same boy who'd once served at the altar, now filled with a lifetime of resentment. In a moment of pure, blind rage, I put my boot through the only sacred thing we had left. It wasn't just a piece of wood. It was my grandmother's crucifix, a family heirloom, the very one my little sister Eleanor had treasured above all else. And I shattered it. That sound, the splintering of old, dark wood, that was the sound of my final connection to heaven being severed. Or so I thought. My name is Julian, and I'm 62 years old. For most of my life, I've been a man defined by a single, crushing event that turned me away from God and everything I once held dear. I'm telling you this story not because I'm proud of it, but because you need to understand the man I was to comprehend the miracle that followed. You have to see the depths of the hole I was in to appreciate the light that found me there. If you find a connection to this story, if it resonates with you in any way, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. It helps more than you know. And I'd love to hear where you're watching from, so please, drop a comment below and let me know your city or state. It makes this feel less like I'm talking into the void, and more like we're all here together. My story begins in a small, quiet town, where life revolved around two things: family and the church. We weren't just Sunday Catholics. Our faith was woven into the fabric of our daily lives. My older sister Agnes was the devout one, her rosary beads worn smooth from constant prayer. I was the altar boy. I loved the ritual, the mystery of it all. I remember the weight of the cassock on my small shoulders, the smell of incense and melting beeswax, the faint echo of Latin chants that seemed to hold ancient secrets. I remember Father Michael, young and vibrant then, placing the communion wafer on my tongue and believing with every fiber of my being that I was receiving the body of Christ. My world was one of order, of divine plans, of a God who was present and just. And at the center of that world was my younger sister Eleanor. She was all light and laughter, with a faith so pure and simple it could move mountains. She saw beauty in everything, but she especially loved that old crucifix. She'd trace the carved figure with her small fingers and tell me it was a reminder that, even in the worst pain, there was love. Then, when I was 16, the world stopped making sense. Eleanor got sick. It started small, a cough that wouldn't go away, a weariness that settled deep in her bones. The doctors gave it a name, a long, clinical word that meant nothing to me. All I knew was that the light in her eyes was dimming. I prayed like I had never prayed before. I served at every Mass. I made bargains with God in the dead of night. I knelt on the cold stone floor of the church until my knees were raw, begging Him to spare her. Agnes organized prayer groups. The whole community lit candles for my sister. But my prayers, our prayers, went unanswered. The silence from heaven was deafening. Watching Eleanor fade was like watching the color drain from the world. The day she died, a part of me died with her. The boy who loved the scent of incense and the sound of Latin chants was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell, filled with a quiet, simmering rage. My faith didn't just waver. It shattered into a million pieces, just like that crucifix would decades later. I turned my back on the church, on God, on everything that had failed me. Agnes would try to talk to me, her voice soft with concern, quoting scripture about God's mysterious plan. Her words felt like salt in an open wound. Father Michael, now with lines of age etched around his kind eyes, would see me in town and try to speak to me, but I'd meet his gaze with a cold contempt that made him retreat. I built a wall around my heart so thick I thought nothing could ever get through. I sneered at people who went to church, mocked their blind faith. I'd see a nativity scene at Christmas and feel a surge of disgust. It was all a lie, a cruel joke played on the desperate. The God they worshipped was either powerless or a monster, and I wanted nothing to do with him. This bitterness became my companion, my shield. It was easier to be angry than to feel the gaping wound of Eleanor's absence. And for 40 years, that's how I lived. A man haunted by a ghost, running from a god I refused to believe in, yet could not stop being angry at. My parents passed away, leaving me and Agnes to clear out the old family home, a house full of memories I had spent a lifetime trying to bury. And it was there, in the damp, dusty basement, that I was finally forced to confront them. I stood there in the silence of the basement, my breath ragged, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My leg throbbed from the force of the kick. I stared at the pieces of wood scattered on the cold concrete floor, the two halves of the figure, the splintered crossbeam. For 40 years I had carried this rage inside me, a hot, heavy stone in my gut, and in one violent, satisfying motion, I had finally let it out. I had taken a hammer to the icon of my suffering. I expected to feel something. Vindicated, free, a final, triumphant severing of the ties that had bound me to a past I hated. But what I felt was nothing, just a profound, echoing emptiness. The rage was gone, yes, but it had left a vacuum in its place, and the silence of the basement rushed in to fill it. The dust motes danced in the single beam of light from the grimy window, indifferent. The smell of mildew and decay seemed stronger, as if I had just broken the seal on a tomb. I turned my back on the pieces, went upstairs, and washed my hands, scrubbing them as if to get rid of a stain that wasn't there. I told myself it was done. A chapter closed, but the image of that broken figure was burned onto the back of my eyelids. The next few days were strange. I tried to go back to my routine. My life was built on routine. It was a fortress against chaos, against feeling. I'd wake up at 6, make the same black coffee, read the paper cover to cover, even the sections I didn't care about. Then I'd work in my small garage, tinkering with old clocks, something I did for a little extra money in retirement. The meticulous work, the tiny gears and springs, it usually calmed me. But now, my hands trembled. I'd drop a tiny screw and curse with a fury that was all out of proportion. At night, sleep wouldn't come. I'd lie in the dark, and the silence of my own house would feel as vast and empty as that basement. The silence was no longer a comfort. It was an accusation. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the house settling, sounded like a footstep. I started leaving a light on in the hallway. I, Julian, a man who prided himself on his pragmatism, his utter lack of superstition, was suddenly afraid of the dark. It was about a week after the incident. A Tuesday. I remember it was raining, a cold, miserable drizzle that matched the gray landscape of my mood. I was in the garage, trying to reassemble a beautiful old mantel clock. My frustration was mounting. A tiny spring refused to catch. My fingers felt clumsy, thick. I felt a strange tightness in my chest. I brushed it off as indigestion. I'd been eating poorly, skipping meals. But the tightness didn't go away. It started to radiate, a dull, heavy pressure spreading across my chest, into my shoulder. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. My left arm began to ache, then tingle, then go numb. I knew, with a sudden, horrifying clarity, what was happening. I tried to stand up from my workbench, to get to the phone in the kitchen. My legs wouldn't cooperate. They felt like they were made of lead. The room started to tilt, the edges of my vision blurring, turning gray. The neat rows of tools on the pegboard, my symbols of order and control, swam before my eyes. I managed to stumble a few feet before my legs gave out completely. I hit the concrete floor of the garage, the impact jarring my teeth. The last thing I remember was the smell of oil and sawdust, and a single overwhelming thought. So this is it. This is how it ends. Alone, on a dirty floor. I don't know how long I was out. I woke up to the sound of a siren, getting closer. My neighbor, Mr. Henderson, must have seen me fall through the open garage door. The world came back in flashes of light and distorted sound, the faces of paramedics, their voices calm but urgent, the prick of a needle in my arm, the ceiling of an ambulance rushing past. And through it all, a terror so profound it was paralyzing. In that moment, all my carefully constructed walls, my cynicism, my anger, my proud atheism, they were all gone. They were just sandcastles against a tidal wave of pure, primal fear. I was no longer a man defined by his intellectual rejection of God. I was just a terrified animal, trapped and dying. In the hospital, under the harsh fluorescent lights, the feeling of helplessness was absolute. I was a collection of symptoms, a chart of numbers, a body hooked up to machines that beeped and whirred, each sound a reminder of how little control I had. Agnes came, of course. Her face was a mask of worry, her hand cool on my feverish forehead. She started to talk about prayer, about God's mercy, and for the first time in 40 years, I didn't have the strength to snarl at her. I just turned my face to the wall. The silence I got back was worse than her words. Lying there, in that sterile white room, I had nothing but time. Time to think. Time to face the void I had so smugly insisted was all that awaited us. And I was terrified. My disbelief brought me no comfort. It was a cold, empty blanket. There was no peace in the idea of oblivion, only a horrifying, crushing finality. The anger I had held onto for so long felt so small, so pointless. What had it gotten me? A life of bitterness, a heart full of stones, and now, here I was, alone, my body failing, staring into the abyss I had chosen. The memory of the broken crucifix came back, unbidden and sharp. The crack of the wood, the hollow sound it made, and for the first time I didn't feel a shred of triumph. I felt a wave of shame so powerful it made me sick to my stomach. I had shattered a symbol of love, Eleanor's love, my grandmother's love, out of sheer, spiteful pride. And what did I have to show for it? An empty garage, an empty house, and an empty soul. That was my rock bottom. A hospital bed, the rhythmic beep of a machine counting down my seconds, and the crushing weight of a lifetime of wrong turns. It's not easy to revisit that feeling of complete desolation. If this story is resonating with you, if you've ever felt that kind of emptiness, a simple like on the video would mean a great deal to me. And please, hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happened in that hospital room, because what came next changed everything. The nights were the worst. In the daytime, there was the noise of the hospital, the routine of nurses and doctors, the distraction of the television droning on in the corner. But at night, the machines I was tethered to were the only company I had. The steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was a constant reminder of the fragile muscle in my chest that had betrayed me. The slow, rhythmic whoosh of some other device was the sound of my own manufactured breathing. I would lie there in the semi-darkness, the only light coming from the hallway spilling under my door, and I would just listen and think. For the first time in my adult life, I had no walls left. My anger, my pride, my carefully constructed intellectual arguments against faith, they had all crumbled to dust on that garage floor. I was just a scared old man in a paper gown, staring at a ceiling stained with water spots that looked like disapproving faces. I thought about Eleanor. I tried to remember her laugh, but all I could summon was the image of her in that hospital bed, so small and pale. The memory was so sharp it was a physical pain, a new ache to accompany the one in my chest. And I thought about the crucifix, the sound of it breaking, the sight of the splintered wood. And the shame, the shame was a living thing. It crawled over me in the dark, a cold and heavy blanket, suffocating me with the weight of my own bitterness. I had desecrated the one thing she loved, the one thing that had brought her comfort. I had spit in the face of my own history, my own family. I wasn't just a man who didn't believe. I was a vandal, a destroyer. And in the silent judgment of that hospital room, I finally admitted to myself that I deserved whatever was coming. It was on the third night, I think. Time had started to blur. I was drifting in and out of a restless, drug-hazy sleep. The pain medication made the world feel distant, fuzzy around the edges. I remember opening my eyes, and the room was different. The harsh digital glow of the monitors was still there, but the oppressive darkness in the corner of the room, by the window, had softened. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a deep, velvety blue, like the sky just after the sun has set. And it was glowing, not with a bright, aggressive light, but a gentle, internal luminescence, as if the color itself was alive. I blinked, trying to clear my head. A hallucination. It had to be. A side effect of the morphine. I tried to turn my head away, to focus on the water pitcher on my bedside table, on anything real. But I couldn't. My eyes were fixed on that corner. The blue light began to coalesce, to gather itself into a form. It wasn't sudden or frightening. It was slow, peaceful, like watching a cloud take shape. And then, she was there. A woman, bathed in this soft, impossible light. I knew, instantly, who she was. There was no mistaking it. It wasn't a grand, Baroque image from a church painting. She was simple, her expression filled with a sorrow so profound, it seemed to contain all the grief in the world. But it wasn't a despairing sorrow. It was knowing. It was a sorrow that understood. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. She just looked at me. And in her eyes, I saw no condemnation. I saw no anger for what I had done to the image of her son. I saw only a compassion that was so vast, so infinite. It shattered the last remaining piece of my hardened heart. It was the look of a mother who had also watched a child suffer. A mother who understood loss. In that silent gaze, she wasn't a queen of heaven or a distant theological concept. She was a fellow traveler in grief, and she was offering me a comfort I had denied myself for 40 years. Everything inside me broke. A sob tore its way out of my chest. A raw, guttural sound I hadn't made since I was a boy. The tears came, hot and unstoppable, carving paths through the stubble on my cheeks. They weren't tears of fear or self-pity. They were tears of shame, of regret, of a lifetime of wasted anger. I was laid bare before that silent, compassionate gaze, and I saw myself for what I was. A bitter, broken child who had thrown a tantrum that lasted 4 decades. I had carried the pain of Eleanor's death like a shield, but in that moment, I saw that it was a cage, and this presence, was offering me the key. I don't know how long it lasted. It could have been seconds or an hour. Time had ceased to mean anything. Then, as gently as she had appeared, she faded. The blue light dissolved back into the shadows, and I was alone again in the sterile quiet of the room. The only sound, the beeping of the monitor, and my own ragged breathing. But the room was no longer empty. The suffocating weight was gone. In its place was a stillness, a fragile peace. The shame was still there, but it was no longer a poison. It was a clean wound. A few minutes later, the door creaked open. A nurse I hadn't seen before came in to check my vitals. She was older, with kind, tired eyes. She saw the tears on my face and simply put a cool hand on my arm. "It's all right," she said, her voice soft. "It's a lot to go through. Just rest now. The doctor said your numbers are looking much better this morning. You're stronger than you think." Her words were simple, clinical even, but they felt like a message. You're stronger than you think. The next day, Agnes came to visit. She was carrying a small paper bag. She pulled out a prayer card. "Father Michael sent this," she said, her voice hesitant, unsure of how I'd react. "He's been praying for you." She handed it to me. On the card was an image of the Virgin Mary. It was an old, simple rendering, not a famous one, and my breath caught in my throat. The face, the expression of serene, knowing sorrow, it was the same. Exactly the same. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't the morphine. It was real. What I saw in that room, it changed the very fabric of my reality. If this part of the story touched you, please, a simple like on the video would mean so much. And hit that notification bell, because you'll want to hear how I tried to put the pieces back together, both literally and figuratively. I held that small, flimsy prayer card in my trembling hand, the paper cool against my skin. My logical mind, the part of me I had always trusted, the part that built my fortress of cynicism, was screaming. It was a coincidence, a trick of the light and the drugs. The mind is a powerful thing, it told me, especially a mind under extreme duress. It can create patterns where there are none. It can pull a forgotten image from the depths of your memory, a picture seen in a book, a painting glimpsed in a museum years ago, and project it onto the shadows of a dark room. It was a hallucination, a textbook case of stress-induced psychosis. My brain, starved for oxygen during the attack, had simply misfired. That was the rational explanation. That was the sane explanation. And I clung to it like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. For a day or two, it almost worked. I told myself I was recovering from a major medical event, that my perceptions were unreliable. I focused on the physical world, the taste of the bland hospital food, the scratchiness of the sheets, the feeling of my feet touching the cold linoleum floor for the first time. But the experience wouldn't let me go. It wasn't a memory that faded, it was a presence that lingered. At night, I'd close my eyes, and I wouldn't see darkness. I'd see that soft, impossible blue. I'd see her eyes, filled with that ocean of sorrow and compassion. It wasn't frightening. It was persistent. It was a quiet, unshakable truth that had taken root in my soul, and my rational mind's frantic attempts to weed it out were useless. The arguments I made to myself started to sound thin, hollow. Coincidence? That the image on a random prayer card handed to me by my sister would be the exact face from my hallucination? Possible, I suppose. But the feeling, the overwhelming sense of peace, and of being utterly, completely seen, you can't explain that away with neurology. That wasn't a brain misfiring. That was my soul, being spoken to in a language it had forgotten it knew. This battle in my mind was relentless. A constant war between the man I had been for 40 years and the man who had knelt, spiritually, in that hospital room. If you've ever felt that kind of war inside yourself, that struggle between your head and your heart, let me know by hitting the like button. And please, make sure you're subscribed, with notifications turned on, because the steps I took next were the hardest of my entire life. When I was finally discharged, Agnes drove me home. The world outside the hospital seemed too bright, too loud. As we pulled into my driveway, I saw my garage door was still open, just as I'd left it, the place where I had fallen. Agnes must have seen me looking, because she put a gentle hand on my arm. "Let's just get you inside," she said softly, but I couldn't go inside the house, not yet. I walked, my steps still a bit unsteady, into the garage. It was cold, and the smell of oil and sawdust was still there. My eyes went to the floor, to the faint chalk outline the paramedics had drawn, and then I looked towards the house, towards the basement door. I knew I had to go down there. Agnes started to protest, but I just shook my head. This was something I had to do alone. Each step down those rickety wooden stairs was a descent into my own personal hell. The damp, musty air was thick with my failure. And there they were, the pieces of the crucifix, lying on the concrete floor exactly where I had left them, covered in a fine layer of dust. I knelt down, my knees protesting, and just looked at them. The splintered wood, the two halves of the broken figure, and the shame. It wasn't a wave this time. It was a drowning. Every cruel word I had ever spoken about faith came rushing back. I remembered mocking Agnes for lighting a candle for Eleanor on her birthday. "You really think that does anything?" I'd sneered. I remembered seeing a family saying grace in a restaurant and rolling my eyes so dramatically they all saw me. I remembered telling Father Michael, who had only ever shown me kindness, that he was selling fairy tales to the weak. Each memory was a fresh cut. I had prided myself on my intellectual superiority, on my refusal to believe in superstition. But kneeling there on that cold floor, I saw that my disbelief hadn't been intellectual at all. It was a tantrum. A 40-year-long, soul-destroying tantrum thrown by a heartbroken boy who couldn't get what he wanted. My pride had been a mask for my pain, and my anger had been a shield against my grief. I had become a vandal, not just of a piece of wood but of my own heart. I had rejected love, mercy, and hope, because I felt they had rejected me first. I don't know how long I knelt there, but a new feeling began to surface through the shame. A resolve. A desperate, terrifying need to do something, to fix what I had broken. I couldn't stay here, in this basement, in this house of bitterness, a moment longer. I stood up, my joints cracking, and walked out of the garage, past Agnes, who watched me with a worried, questioning look. I got in my car, and I just started driving. I didn't have a destination in mind, but my hands seemed to know where to go. They steered me through the familiar streets of my town, past the library, past the grocery store, and then they turned onto the street that led to St. Michael's. The church of my childhood. I hadn't set foot inside it since Eleanor's funeral. I parked across the street and just sat there, staring at the stone facade, the stained glass windows that were dark and unreadable from the outside. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might be having another attack. Every instinct screamed at me to put the car in reverse and drive away. "Cars, what are you doing, you old fool? They'll laugh at you. You don't belong here." The voice of my old self was loud, venomous. But the quiet persistence of that blue light was stronger. After what felt like an eternity, I opened the car door and walked across the street. The heavy oak door groaned as I pulled it open, a sound that echoed from my deepest memories. And I stepped inside. The air inside was cool and still, thick with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and something else. Something I hadn't smelled in 40 years, peace. I had expected to feel like an intruder, a trespasser. I had expected the weight of the crucifix-topped dome to crush me with guilt. But that's not what I felt. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the stained glass, I felt quiet. The rage that had been my constant companion, the engine that had driven me for my entire adult life, was gone. It had burned out, leaving behind not the empty void I had known, but a clean, silent space. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing softly in the cavernous room. I ran my hand along the smooth, dark wood of a pew, the same pew where I had sat with my parents and Agnes and Eleanor, her little legs too short to reach the floor. The memories weren't painful anymore. They were just there. Memories of a boy I barely recognized, a boy whose world had been full of a simple, unquestioning light. I didn't pray. I didn't know how. I just sat in that front pew, the one reserved for the altar boys, and I breathed. For the first time, I just breathed. Of course, the story got out. Small towns are like that. I had to tell Agnes what happened, the whole truth, from the basement to the hospital room. She listened without a word, her eyes wide, tears streaming down her face. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just held my hand and said, "Grace finds us in the strangest of places, Julian." She told Father Michael, and soon the whispers started. The news of Julian, the town's resident cynic, the man who hadn't been seen in church since the 70s, having some kind of episode. The reactions were what you might expect. My old friend Tom, who I'd had coffee with every Thursday for 20 years, clapped me on the shoulder and chuckled. "It's the medication, Julian," he said, not unkindly. "You had a major trauma. The mind plays tricks. Don't go getting all religious on me now." My neighbor, Mr. Henderson, the one who called the ambulance, looked at me with pity. "You were close to death," he said. "People see things. It's a chemical reaction in the brain. Perfectly normal." Some were less charitable. I heard through the grapevine that I was losing my mind, that my grief had finally cracked me, that I was a hypocrite, looking for a crutch now that my health was failing. In the past, those words would have filled me with a self-righteous fury. I would have argued, debated, presented them with a litany of logical reasons why they were fools and I was enlightened. But I had no fight left in me. I didn't try to convince them. When Tom told me it was the medication, I just nodded and said maybe. But it was the most real experience of my life. When Mr. Henderson explained the neurology of a dying brain, I just said, I can't explain it. I just know what I saw. My conviction wasn't loud or argumentative. It was a quiet, unshakable stone that had settled in the center of my soul. I didn't need them to believe me. It was enough that I believed. I started going to St. Michael's, just for the daily morning mass. I'd sit in the back, a ghost from the town's past. At first, people would stare, but Father Michael from the altar would give me a small, knowing nod. And after a few weeks, people stopped staring. A woman named Maria offered me a hymnal. An older gentleman named Frank asked me how I was feeling. They didn't ask about my vision, they just made space for me. I was welcomed not into a club of the righteous, but into a hospital for the broken. And I was home. My penance was a private one. I had gathered the pieces of the crucifix from the basement floor, every last splinter. I took them to my workshop, the same place where I had fallen. With hands that still trembled slightly, I began the painstaking work of putting them back together. I bought special wood glue, tiny clamps. It was the most delicate work I had ever done. Every time I joined two pieces of the splintered wood, it felt like I was mending a piece of my own fractured heart. The figure of Christ was the hardest, rejoining the torso, the arms, the head. I saw not a symbol of a distant God, but the image of a love that allowed itself to be broken for the sake of the broken. When it was finally done, it was far from perfect. The cracks were visible, dark lines mapping the violence I had done to it. It was scarred, it was flawed, it was beautiful. A few months later, St. Michael's held its annual parish picnic. Agnes insisted I go. The thought terrified me, to be there, with everyone, in the open, but I knew I had to. At one point, Father Michael stood up to say a few words of thanks, and then he looked at me. "Julian," he said, his voice carrying across the lawn, "I believe you have something you'd like to share." Every eye turned to me. My old self would have died. But I stood up, my heart calm, and I walked to the front. I looked out at the faces of my neighbors, my friends, the people who had known me my whole life as a bitter, angry man. "I don't have a sermon," I started, my voice hoarse. "I just have a confession. For 40 years, many of you have only known my anger. You've heard my scorn. I mocked your faith, I despised your piety, and I rejected your kindness. I was a man who believed pride was a strength and mercy was a weakness. And I was wrong." I took a deep breath. I was a vandal. In my own home, I took a symbol of this faith, a thing my own sister treasured, and I destroyed it out of spite. I broke it. And then I broke. And when I was on the floor, in the darkest, most terrifying moment of my life, the very thing I had spent a lifetime rejecting, it came for me. It didn't send lightning. It didn't send condemnation. It sent a mother. And she showed me that I wasn't hated. I was just lost. The thing I spit on was the very thing that lifted me from the ground. I can't take back the years of bitterness. All I can do is stand here and say I'm sorry and thank you. Silence. And then Maria, the woman who gave me the hymnal, started to clap. Then Frank. And soon, the whole parish. Not a standing ovation, but a gentle, welcoming applause. It wasn't praise. It was acceptance. My journey isn't over. My faith isn't perfect. It's like that restored crucifix that now sits on my bedside table. The scars are still there. They always will be. But they are no longer a mark of my rage. They are a map of my redemption. It wasn't about changing my religion. It was about my heart being changed. It was about learning that the opposite of faith isn't doubt, it's pride. And the cure for pride is a grace so profound, it will meet you in the wreckage you yourself have made. If this story found a crack in your own walls, if you've ever felt that pull from the dark towards a light you couldn't explain, I would be so grateful if you'd let me know by liking this video. It tells me that these stories matter. And if you believe that stories of hope and second chances are worth sharing, please subscribe and turn on your notifications so we can continue this journey together. I read every comment, and I truly want to hear yours. Tell me, where in your own life have you seen a light you couldn't quite explain? Thank you for listening.